to everybody for joining us today and giving up your time. We're very aware of how busy lives in education are, so we're really glad that you can join us today for our TeachMeet on how to lead change for subject leads, the new EEF implementation guidance. I just want to say a huge thank you from the subject leads team. Our mission is to empower those who lead subjects and to lead your subject your way. So we're really happy to be working today with Nicola and Stacey from the Staffordshire Research School. If you want to find a bit more about Twinkl subject leads, you can find us at www.twinkl.co.uk/subject-leads, and we're on all social platforms with a Facebook group as well. So I'm going to hand over now to Nikki and Stacey, and I hope you enjoy.
Fantastic. Thank you, Katie. Hi, everyone. I hope you've had a great day. Thank you so much for giving up your time this afternoon to come and learn all about implementation, how we could do that effectively. My name's Nicola Arkinstall, and I'm the Director of Staffordshire Research School. And I'm with my colleague, Stacey Jordan, who will introduce herself as well when she comes. I'm going to do the first half, and then Stacey's going to do the second half. So this is what we're going to focus on today, is the EEF's new guide to implementation. We have put a Padlet together for you, so if you scan that QR code or go to that web address when you get the slides, you will find all the resources, all the documents that can really support effective implementation, all the research that underpins that guidance report is there as well, as long as with some resources and some implementation sessions. So in terms of our overview, it's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the guidance report, really. It'll hopefully just start to introduce you to what the research is telling us about how we can affect change in our schools in a really effective way, so they make a difference in our classrooms and in our subjects as subject leads. So I'm going to do a really short introduction to the EEF and Research School network, so you know who we are. Then I'm going to focus in on the first recommendation of that guidance report, which is about the behaviours that enable change. We're then going to pass over to Stacey, who's going to look at the second recommendation, which is about the contextual factors. And hopefully throughout the session, you'll have some time to reflect and plan. And when we're discussing what the research says and what the recommendations are, what we'd really like you to do is really do that reflection on what does that look like for me currently? Am I already doing these things? And am I doing them in a really high quality way? Or is that something actually I haven't thought about and that might enhance when I'm trying to develop my subject area within my school? And we'll give you some reflection questions there. And hopefully from that, you'll come up with some actions you might want to go away and do. So in terms of the EEF then, if you haven't heard of us, so we're the Education Endowment Foundation, and we are an independent charity, and we're dedicated to breaking that link between family income and educational achievement. And it is really sad that, despite everyone's best efforts, despite pupil premium funding, sadly that gap is growing. And even before COVID, the gap had stopped closing. Obviously, COVID has put a massive dent in that, and that gap has massively widened. Good news is this year in the Key Stage 2 results that it has started to rise back up, and that gap has started to close gradually, but it's still way above it was before COVID. And we do this by supporting schools, nurseries and colleges to improve the teaching and learning through better use of research and evidence. And we do events like this. We do lots of different CPD, we do partnerships, we do podcasts, blogs, TikTok, to try and get that message out there about what the research is telling us are those best bets to really make a difference in our schools. So in terms of the EEF, then there are 3 branches. We generate research by doing trials, and if you go to the EEF website, you can put your school's postcode in there and it will tell you which trials are recruiting, and that gives you opportunity to access really high quality professional development and programs at a reduced or free cost to schools. We also then synthesize that research, and we've got a teaching and learning toolkit, an early years toolkit, and lots of guidance reports on many different subject areas like science, maths, English, effective feedback that really help to put that research into a palatable, readable document with lots of case studies, ideas and resources to help you enact that into your schools. And then the research schools, we're the mobilisation arm. So we get out to schools, we put on events like this to actually, we know that creating these documents isn't going to make changes in schools. What makes changes is leaders talking to other leaders and sharing that resources and research out there. So the research schools are the mobilisation arm. There's 33 of us across the country, so it might be worth looking at which one is your closest research school, but also looking at all the research schools because they put on a lot of online training as well. So in terms of our guidance report then, this quote from Becky Francis, who was our CEO, but she's now leading the curriculum review, talks about that effective implementation has a crucial role to play in our collective efforts to break that link between family income and education outcomes. And I think there is a much more palatable, people want to use research, want to use evidence, but there's a bit of a knowing doing gap in terms of people sometimes know what the research says, but they don't know how to actually enact that and make a change in their classrooms. And the only way we do that is by effective implementation. And as a subject leader, if you want to make changes in your subject, if you want to improve your subject area, it's about how you're implementing those changes that really matter in terms of having those better outcomes in your subject area. So this new report was updated and came out in May and June. If you've done an MPQ, you may be aware of the old guidance report, and in the old one there were 6 recommendations, and that was a really effective report in terms of helping people to understand the process of effective implementation, and it looked at the different phases of implementation, in terms of exploring and finding and identifying your priority in your subject area. So what data do you triangulate to really know what's going on in your subject area, but also where are those development areas? What is it that really needs developing? Then it's that preparing for delivery and preparing to make that change that's going to improve your subject area. Then it's delivering some CPD, some coaching, some professional development, delivering a new strategy in your subject area, monitoring that delivery, and then sustaining that new way of working that's going to have more improved outcomes. And so it gave a really clear structure on implementation, and really good in terms of looking at the wording and making sure we're all clear about the words to use, the definitions of implementation. However, it really missed out a big part of implementation. It hit the mark in terms of implementation, but it missed the point, because actually what matters in implementation, when we're trying to make changes in our subject areas, what really matters is the people, and it's about what people think, what people do in the classrooms, and that was a big part that was missed out. So with the review and this new document, first of all, we thought it might just be a few tweaks, but actually what resulted was a shift in the way we think about implementation. And the first document really talked about treating implementation as a process, not as a one-off event, that it's a process that takes time and you have to go through those different phases. But the new updated guidance report really talks about how to do that well by engaging with colleagues, by getting colleagues on board so they will make those changes you want in your subject area. So really what it resulted in was implementation is fundamentally a really collaborative and a social process, and it really is driven by how people think. So what they think about, your subject area, the changes you want to make in there, how they behave in their classrooms, and what strategies they use, and also how they interact with each other to really make a difference in that subject area. As well as being the director of the research school, I'm also a primary practitioner, and I've led on many subjects, art, music, DT, and I've utilised this guidance report that's really helped me to make those changes in my subject areas to really make a difference and an impact on the outcomes for the pupils in those areas. As far as we know, it's the largest review of evidence on implementation. And again, what I love about the EEF is that, what busy school leaders have got time to go away and read 3,373 really detailed research reports. But they've done that for us, and they've synthesised it into hopefully a palatable guidance report that really does have recommendations that can help us day to day to make improvements in our subjects. So if we have a look at the new report then, the old one that came out in 2017 had 6 recommendations. It's now down to 3. And all those 6 from the previous report, if you use the old report, are now in recommendation 3 of this new report. But what's really good is they've added number 1, which is adopting the behaviours that drive effective implementation, and also attending to those contextual factors. And those are the two that we're going to drill down a bit deeper into this afternoon, because they're the new elements of the report. So this is what it looks like now. So we've got the behaviours, and they really are the beating heart of the guidance report. They are really what drive effective implementation. And that is how we engage with our colleagues, how we unite them around our subject area and those developments we want to make in our subject area, and also how we reflect and monitor our subject area to really make sure our implementation is on track. The second recommendation is around those contextual factors. So it's what's being implemented, so what strategies you're trying to implement in your subject, what systems and structures you have in place, and who are the people who enable change. And obviously you are the champions of your subjects in your schools, but it's how do you get other people to support with that, and Stacey is going to go into that in more detail. And then the third recommendation is this framework that supports the sort of process of implementation. And again, there's been a few tweaks to that. So we're going to have a look at recommendation 1 then. So this is where we adopt those behaviours that drive effective implementation. So there are 3 cross-cutting behaviours that really get to the heart of what drives that effective implementation. And these behaviours should feature across all implementation strategies and actions. Okay, so at the back of the guidance report, and obviously the guidance report is freely available on the EEF website, it's on the Padlet, there is a big list of strategies, and when you're doing any of those strategies, what's important is that you are really drilling these behaviours throughout that. Okay, so if we look at those 3 then, so it's engage, so it's how do we engage people so they can shape what happens, but also as the subject leader, you providing the overall direction of travel in that subject. How we unite, so how we unite colleagues around what is being implemented, how it's going to be implemented, and why it matters. So why those developments in your subject area matter, and how they can do that, and give them those tools for that. And also that reflection. So how do we reflect, we monitor and adapt throughout any changes and developments we're making to ensure that it is really having a difference in the classrooms to make a difference to the outcomes of our pupils in our subject. So the first one then, I'll just let you read that quote for a second. And so it just really reinforces that when the school community feels included in decisions that affect them, then implementation is likely to improve, and people ultimately value what they feel part of. And so it's about thinking about yourself as a person. When you're asked to or told to do something and you've got no control over it, how motivated are you to do that? Whereas compare that to things where you feel like you have a bit of control, a bit of say, you're part of that decision-making process, then that can really shift the motivation of our colleagues. And then within this recommendation, there are 3 things really that we need to consider. So one is, how do we give people the opportunities to have that potential to influence change? So when we are trying to make changes in our subject area, when we are trying to develop things, it's how do we give them an opportunity to share their perspectives on it, on a way forward. And obviously as the leader, you need to go with what needs to be developed, and you might look at the research and come up with ideas for how to move forward in that area. But it's always useful to find out what is actually happening in the classroom so they can share their perspective. What are their challenges? What are their barriers to implementing this strategy in your subject area? Sharing their ideas, sharing their concerns, and really our job as subject leaders is to remove those barriers and those concerns, but where they feel like that they can have a say. So it could be, for example, we did a big review of behaviour. So my behaviour lead led that. He did a big review of behaviour. He went away and identified the areas we needed to improve on. And then he came back to the team with some suggested evidence-informed solutions. But as a team, we co-constructed the way forward and the plan that we were going to move forward on. So it's about, giving them a say in terms of how it should move forward, really. And so they feel like they're being listened to. I know some strategies for this is things like surveys, maybe focus groups, maybe implementation teams. So you might have a team within your subject that you can really engage and get their viewpoints. Another one is if you're trying to implement a new strategy in your subject, you try it in your own classroom, or you get a couple of colleagues to try that out first. And before you roll it out to everybody. So it gives you that chance to really gain the views of, does it work in our school? What are those barriers? What are those challenges? And you unpick those before you then roll that out to everybody who's teaching your subject within the area. So really giving them that opportunity to feel like that they're being listened to. I think with that one, that they're being listened to, that any barriers, any challenges, and where possible and where appropriate, they're part of that decision making of how you're going to move forward with that development area. The second part of engaging colleagues is in a collaborative processes. So it's how we give them opportunities to bounce ideas off each other, to share that good practice. So if you are implementing a new strategy in your subject, it's if you see really good pockets of practice, giving them that opportunity to go and see it, to share that good practice, to celebrate that good practice that's going on. It's also about how you can collaboratively solve any problems that are coming up within that area. And implementation teams are really effective with that one in terms of that collaboration. And then the third one is we need those sort of participatory ways of getting people to engage. But then we also, as the subject lead, need to have that clear communication and active guidance. So, you control that direction of travel for your subject. You explain the decisions you've made, and how if you have sought their views beforehand, how their views have been put into the decisions you're making for your subject area. And also corralling those efforts. So, motivating people's efforts, preventing implementation being dragged off track. So it's, how do we keep that implementation on track? So that those developments you want to make in your subject are taking root. And when we talk about giving people opportunity to share their views, that doesn't just relate to teachers in the organisation. It could also relate to support staff, to pupils themselves, that pupil voice, parent views, if it's something to link with homework maybe about your subject area, or about policy decisions. So it's how do you engage people so they feel like they're part of it? And these graphs always come to mind in this one. Is thinking about when we have high psychological safety, so where we have a culture where people feel like their views, they can truly say their views, but also you have those high standards. So it's high challenge, but also high support. Obviously, we want to be in that top quadrant of that learning zone. The other one I think about here is if we do it with people, then it's sort of that restorative, that relationship building approach. Whereas we're not just doing it to them and they feel like it's a punitive thing where they're being told to do something. If they don't do it, they're getting in trouble for it. It doesn't get that culture right. Or if, we don't involve them at all, we're neglecting them or permissive. So it's really getting into that zone where we feel like we're doing it with people rather than to them. So there's just a few reflection questions here to think about in terms of your role in your subject in your school. So how do you engage people so they have a potential to influence change? And if you do have any good ideas, please do put them in the chat. It'd be great to hear if you've got some really good ways that are successful in your subject area that can support other subject leaders. So have you got any good ways? Do you do things like surveys, focus groups, implementation teams? How do you engage people in collaborative processes? So how do you, solve problems together in your teams? And how do you engage people through that clear communication and that active guidance? And also this one here about how do you involve teachers, TAs, parents and students to gain that really comprehensive understanding of the current situation and also identifying those barriers to change. So just for a minute, just have a think about what is it, what can you do or what do you do that can support that? And it's also thinking of doing it in a quality way rather than in a superficial way. Because again, when we've done this training before, we've had leaders say, oh yeah, I send surveys out, I get the views of my staff. But when they think about it, they think, oh, actually, no one actually fills them in. No one responds. So yeah, they've engaged, but actually, are they truly engaging if they don't get that feedback from anyone? So again, it's about doing it in a purposeful and a meaningful way, where people feel like, yes, I will be listened to. Because again, with that leader, it might be they've sent out surveys in the past, people have filled them in, but nothing is ever fed back to them on how their views have been used or sought. So again, it's when you do ask, gain views, it's making sure you feed back to how have their views been inputted into the decisions you're making as a subject leader to move forward on that. So for example, when I was lead art, I had asked colleagues what they wanted professional development on, and then I got a coach into school that because they wanted it on sculpture. So again, that's engaging staff, because instead of me just going, right, I think they want it on painting, or just putting in what I think, it's giving them a view on what do they want professional development on in that subject area. So my staff said, well, we're not too confident on the sculpture units. So then I got a coaching that could come and work with those teachers on that particular area they wanted. So that's how we can engage them, by building in the areas they want, so they can feel really purposeful and meaningful to them, rather than just going my agenda and what I wanted them to do. It's how can we have input onto that as well. Please do put in the chat if you've got any good ideas or views, and share those with other people, any ways you do that. So we'll move on to the second behaviour then. This is about uniting colleagues. And again, I'll just give you a minute to read that quote on this slide. So this one is about uniting people around what is being implemented. So what are those changes you want making in your subject area? What is it that needs developing and improving? So they understand the why, unite them around it, how it's going to be implemented. So they really clearly know what it's going to look like, what those expectations are. They've got that really high quality professional development, so they understand how to do that in their classrooms with their pupils. They've got the resources, the confidence. They've seen good examples of it. They've seen non-examples of what it shouldn't look like in your subject area, and also why it matters that you make those changes and those developments in the subject that you're trying to lead. And it can be traced back to different values. If people don't agree, or it goes against their sort of views on how that strategy should be taught, or that subject area should be taught, or they don't understand how that the new area you're trying to get them to develop in there, or those practices, that's how it can change. So with this one, when you have got differing values, and again, another one we see for this is sort of early years colleagues. And early years can look very different in very different schools. If you're trying to lead on early years, people can have really inherent views on what they think it should look like, or how they think a subject should be taught. But I think the way you get around that is by really making it really explicit what the benefits are of using the strategies you want them to use, or the development you're trying to develop, and also clearly spelling out the risks if we don't improve the area of the subject, what those risks are to the pupils, and just trying to get more common ground between your values of what you want your vision of your subject to look like, closer to their vision and values as well. And again, it's really important we're giving them those core components. What are those key elements of effective teaching in your subject area? So they're clear about what that looks like. So, things that have worked well here is giving them opportunities to go and see other people teach lessons that are high quality in that particular area. So the school I work in was an English hub. So we had many schools come and look at our phonics. So our reading lead would take them around to the different lessons. But again, when you're observing lessons, what's really key is that you as the subject leader are unpicking what are those elements of core practice, what is it that's happening, what are the decisions, and what is the teacher doing that makes it effective. So when we show teachers around our school, the reading lead has a microphone on, the other teachers have headphones in, and as they're watching the reading lesson, she's narrating what that teacher's doing. Obviously that's fantastic, we've got those opportunities, but even not, it's just, if you're going, especially with ECTs or someone who hasn't got good subject knowledge of your area, taking them to someone who has and seeing a really good example, but you coaching them and narrating what's going well in that lesson can be really effective here, so that people really understand what are those core components, those key elements of the lesson that are making it effective. And again, it's when we are trying to make some changes in our area, it's making sure we give staff that high quality professional development, so they feel really confident when they have to go and do it in front of the children in their classroom. So there's just a quote here from X that was from teachers in New York. So they had a massive shift in their reading curriculum sort of overnight. So their schools closed like there's some holidays. They opened again in September, whenever they opened in New York, and without any CPD or some proper development, they had to change their way of working. So they said the general sentiment in my school is we're being asked to start something without really knowing what it should look like. And I feel like I'm improvising. So, you know, it's making sure in your school that if you're asking people to make a change in the way they teach your subject, that they're not going in thinking, I'm not confident here, I don't know what it should look like, giving them that clear view of what good looks like. And there's another quote there, it's hard to know how to implement something without knowing precisely what that it is. Yet surprisingly often schools head into making changes without a shared understanding of what is being implemented. So do you have that shared understanding around what good looks like in your subject, that everyone is clear about, you know, what are those elements? There's really nice resources that go along with the guidance report about an implementation plan. And again, it gives you some key questions and key ideas to help you plan out that implementation. And that quote at the bottom just again talks about getting closer to people's values. So by exploring those common goals, acknowledging and addressing any concerns, and discussing the risks and benefits of taking action, that is what is going to get that effective uniting and getting colleagues to unite around what needs to be changed in your schools. So again, there's some reflection questions here to help you think about how well you do this in your leadership role. So how can you, or how do you unite values, so people united around the vision for your subject and what you want your subject to look like, united around their knowledge and their understanding of their subject, united around the skills and techniques, and also united around that implementation process in terms of what effective professional development they want, and what you give, so that they really are confident when they go to teach that or change that behaviours in their classroom, that they really are confident with that. So again, just some things to think about in terms of how you unite colleagues around your implementation. And then the third element of recommendation 1 is reflection. And again, I'll just let you read that quote. So this behaviour is around, as subject leaders, really being reflective and making sure that we've got that monitoring, but not monitoring in terms of like an Ofsted inspector or a judgmental way, monitoring as in getting that culture right, so people understand that you're going to be looking at what's going on in classrooms to help them and support them. So it's not about being judgmental, it's about when we're trying to do development in our subject, we need to know what that's looking like in our classroom, so we really can identify how that implementation is going, and we can plan our future professional development for colleagues. Also how we need to adapt and how we need to improve that implementation. And it really is underpinned by those evidence-informed decisions. So using your internal data from your monitoring, so your book looks, your learning walks, your pupil voice, that really identifies those priorities, but also using external research like the EEF guidance reports, the toolkit, to really help you pick those strategies that are going to be most effective in your subject area. And with this one, it's about, in your subject, have you got some structured processes that enable you in your subject to learn and adapt? So do you know what your pupil needs are in your subject area? What are those current practices that are going on in your subject? What's the fit and feasibility of any changes you are trying to make in your subject? What are those barriers? What are those enablers? So what really helps to make those developments in your subject area, and also checking on that implementation progress of those areas you've asked them to change. But it also includes individuals, so creating that culture where individuals in your school adopt that reflective outlook, and they review and refine their own practice as they're moving forward, because that's going to help them to move forward, and seeing it as an ongoing learning process. So with this one, it's thinking about how can you implement these changes in your subject in a way that promotes that continuous learning and that continuous improvement. And I think it's about getting it right, that it's not because what we're doing isn't good enough, but it's because we can always do better. And it's having that sort of culture in our schools that, you know, what we're doing is good, but there's always somewhere to move, and there's always something we can move forward on. But picking something that is achievable and only doing a few things in a quality way, rather than trying to make too many changes at once, because then that gives cognitive overload and doesn't support the well-being of colleagues either. But if we can get these behaviours right in terms of engaging people so they feel part of it, we unite them around and motivate them to want to make the developments, and also we give that reflection and they feel like that they're being listened to and they're encouraged to reflect, then that can really massively increase well-being. And we've seen that in the schools that do adopt these behaviours, that really is going to massively support the well-being of your colleagues, you know, in a really meaningful way, rather than a superficial way of trying to support their well-being. I'm going to pass on to Stacey now, just while you think about that question, and she's going to talk about recommendation 2.
Hi, so I'm Stacey Jordan, and I work for a couple of days a week at the research school, was a head of a secondary school for 10 years and have been a subject leader in 3 different schools. So I'm going to be just talking about recommendation 2, which is about the contextual factors that influence implementation when we're thinking about what, and I hope that you've all got something in your head at the moment, following Nikki's recommendation, about something that you're implementing. And this is about reflecting on whether you are implementing it, taking those behaviours into account. So the contextual factors, in the same way that the behaviours are broken down into 3, the contextual factors also are broken down into 3. And the reason why the contextual factors has been such a big part of the report is that these behaviours that Nikki has just outlined do not happen in a vacuum. And that is why sometimes things that we're implementing do not transfer across schools, because everybody's context is different. Everybody is at a different point of their journey in terms of school improvement and subject improvement. And so what I want to focus on is what sort of contextual factors you should be thinking about, and whether they are at present enabling or constraining your implementation, and whether there is anything you can do to remove some of those barriers. So first of all, Nikki has already shared that diagram and just shared with you that the contextual factors that run alongside the behaviours are what is you're choosing to implement, what systems and structures you have in place or need in place for the strategy to be effective, and whether you have the right people in place to enable that change. So I'm just going to take you through each of those in turn. First of all, I'm just going to focus on the systems and structures. So I'll just give you 30 seconds to just read that. So I think the quote on the right is really pertinent, that as subject leaders, sometimes we do dream big. We absolutely want the best for our students and for our department so that we can be performing to the very best of our ability. But sometimes when we're dreaming big, we don't spend the time thinking about what systems and structures we need to have in place to enable something to happen. And this report sort of emphasises that it is important to make that time as a department team to think through, right, if we want this to happen, what are the systems and structures that are going to enable that to happen, and which systems and structures might be working against what we want, and is there a way around that? And this is a point where if there is a barrier, whether there is a member of a senior member of staff who needs to support you in removing that barrier or changing it so that it doesn't stop the implementation if it's the right thing to do. And on here, I've just got a list of some of the systems and structures that do sometimes act as barriers, or some of the things that we should be considering when we're sitting down with our team and thinking through what we might need to include. So some of it, timetables, for example, the school structures, very difficult to change the school structures from a subject leader's point of view. But actually, is it worth a conversation about whether or not you could, for example, I was head of English in a few different schools, and when I wanted to introduce a dedicated reading slot, I had to go to my senior manager and say, how can you help me put this in place? Because I don't want to take too much time from the English curriculum, and actually that sends the wrong message to the children. Reading is about across the curriculum, so can you help me with the timetable? And they did actually change something so that the first 20 minutes after lunch was always a reading slot, and that didn't detract from curriculum time. So I was very, very grateful for that. Sometimes it's about being brave enough to say, this is what I want. Can you help me accommodate that, I think. Some of the other things to think about with systems and structures are whether you have the right data monitoring systems to give you the information that you need to do that important reflection, which Nikki spoke about. How am I going to tell if this is working? And do I have the monitoring systems that will give me that information, or do I need to put something else in place? And really thinking through, how am I going to know this is working and having the impact I want? I'm sure that everybody in this call will have sometimes put something in place and sort of fingers crossed, hoping for the best. But actually, this is about monitoring and making sure that it is actually delivering what you want it to deliver, and it is making those positive gains. Resources, always an issue as a subject leader. We wish we'd got more money, but actually, again, what are we going to need to enable this to happen well and effectively? The time, we know that anybody in education, I'd be very, very hard pushed if anybody said that they had loads and loads of time. But actually, if you are going to invest in implementing something successfully as a subject leader, how are you going to really focus on those things in any department meeting time you have, briefing time you have, CPD time you have, and how are you going to bring that element to the forefront? As Nikki said, not doing lots and lots of things, actually focusing on one or two things that you really want to change. Policies, again, a bit more difficult working at a subject leader level, but actually, are there any school policies that you might need to have a conversation about? So that again would be something to consider with your senior line manager. And then implementation teams. I was very lucky as being a head of English. I had a very big team, and within that I can sort of say, right, you three are going to be focusing on this area of implementation in relation to year 9, for example. If you're in a smaller team, that's much more difficult to manage, but actually, can you put anybody together to focus on this specific thing for you? And I always say 2 heads are better than 1. That collaborative process, that social process is really important. We don't really, and the report reflects this, people sitting in rooms doing things on their own won't necessarily give you the positive gains that you want. The second contextual factor that I want you to just think about is the people who enable the change. And again, I'll just give you 30 seconds to read that slide. Again, so this is thinking about, do you have the right people in place to enable you to implement this? I'm sure that we have a lot of really enthusiastic subject leaders within this call, but actually, who can help you? You being enthusiastic is massively important, absolutely. But is there anybody else within your team that you can give some responsibility to in relation to the implementation of this strategy? And this phrase, early adopters, has become a bit sort of, quite a few people are using this phrase at the moment. Just who are the people that you can get on board and start to trial things? And if you've got somebody, for example, who is already doing a brilliant job, they might be a little bit more resistant to changing. So actually, how are you going to approach them? Bring them on board, get them to practice it, give them that feeling of success so that they can become one of the biggest advocates for the implementation. I also think support staff is an important thing to think about there. Do you have TAs? Do you have technicians? Are there other people who can support with this implementation? Because the more people you can involve, and the more people that you can direct who are going to enable that change for you, the better chance of success the strategy has. And thirdly, it is going to change, I do apologise, it is what is being implemented. And I'm just going to read you down the left-hand side, just making sure that you are really clear about whether the approach that you have identified is evidence-informed. And as Nikki mentioned earlier, with the synthesis of research, the Teaching and Learning Toolkit is a brilliant resource. It lets you know whether something has got really good gains. Being involved with the trial, for example, might also give you an indication as to whether something is likely to work. And there are best bets as well, where there is promising bits of research that are coming through, and all of that is on the EEF website and freely for for anybody to access. So is the approach evidence informed? Is it right for the setting? Or have you just read something in a blog or a book, or somebody who's shouting very loudly on X, and then thinking, oh yeah, I quite fancy that. And I've been guilty of that in my time. I have thought, right, that looks really exciting, I will do that. But actually, if I'd have sat down and thought about whether it was right for the setting, it may have not have been, and whether it is feasible to implement. If you're working in a department where you've got a couple of people off on long-term sick or whatever else, and we know that these things happen, probably that drive isn't going to be able to happen until you've got a more stable staffing situation. And then I'll just let you read the quote on the right. And again, this is something that I wish that somebody had done this when I was a subject leader in some ways, that actually, if you can really specify what you want it to look like, what it's going to look like when it's successful, and you can guide your staff to get to that point and support them with it, that's really important. And when we've done this training in a variety of settings over the last few months, one of the things that we've sort of said is that actually, setting that culture where your team know that it's not going to go from 0 to 100 in one go, that actually we've got to be prepared through our monitoring and our reflections to sometimes not hit the mark, but actually we're going to feed that back. We're going to create that culture where we keep improving, keep learning from one another, and keep working towards that end goal. And if people know that from the outset, they won't be worried about getting it wrong, because we want to be able to have a culture where it's okay to make mistakes, and it's okay to try new things, particularly if we have got that really rich evidence base. Okay, so again, I've put all of my questions together for contextual factors, but just some things to think about. Who is well placed to help you with your implementation? And again, if we had more time, I would get you to sort of list down all of the people that you can draw on to support you with the implementation, and who are the people that you can really help lean on to support you with driving something through. How can you protect time for your staff to engage in those professional development sessions, so it's not business dominating all the time? There is actually time for that engagement and discussion. How do we use existing data systems to help us monitor and refine what we're doing and making sure that we're still on track? And what specific resources, equipment and administrative support will be needed? The administrative support, again, is something that you need to think about, and make sure that you're speaking to your senior, your line manager about, well, is there any scope here for somebody to support with this element? And schools are always stretched, but there is usually some flex somewhere if you're really specific about what it is you need. So thank you very much. I'm going to hand back to Nikki now for recommendation 3.
Okay, thanks, Stacey. I'm not going to spend too long on recommendation 3. I'm just going to flag it up. So so that if this is something you're not aware of or you haven't seen before, it might be worth going away and looking at. And this is really recommendation 3 of this report, is about adopting a structured but flexible implementation process. So if you're aware of the old guidance report, the process was there, but I think we've made some tweaks to show that it's not rigid, that it should be more flexible. And again, I'll let you read that quote there. And again, we'd love to live in a world where, we see a problem, we identify the solution, we put things in place and it's sorted, but unfortunately it doesn't happen like that. It doesn't happen in a neat way, it doesn't happen in a linear way, because schools are complex. When you're working with people and trying to affect behaviour change, then it can be messy. So what we've done is made sure that it's really clear that it is a process, and that phases do overlap, and they can be revisited over time. But it's very much about ensuring, when you are thinking about your subject area, are you exploring, really assessing those needs, and assessing the approaches that are happening, planning for implementation of those developments you want in your subject area, and practically preparing to support colleagues in that area. Then when you deliver any professional development or support to colleagues, it's giving them that support and encouragement and that monitoring and improvement as you go along. And then when you have put a development in place in your subject, it's how do you sustain that? So that it doesn't, people don't just fall back into reverting to old habits once the, you know, the big thrust and professional that hasn't gone. So again, there's some really nice resources and ideas and case studies in the report to help you with each of those phases. So that's the guidance report. Hopefully that's giving you sort of an understanding and idea of what is covered in that report, and hopefully it will help you to really effectively lead developments and changes, any changes you need to make within your subject area in schools. We are running some extra implementation sessions. So if there's any other colleagues that are leading changes in their subject areas you think might be useful for them, and in each of those we're going to drill down deeper into each of the recommendations. So we're going to do the first recommendation in one, and then the second and the third one in the third one. So again, if this is something that you feel is useful to you, then you can sign up to those for free, and there's a QR code in the link there. But if you Google Staffordshire Research School events, you can find some events there. You can also sign up to our newsletter. We do a newsletter every half term, and again, that's got some really lovely videos, some blogs and things from our evidence leads about how they're putting research-informed approaches into their classroom, and it also gives you opportunities. So again, please do sign up if you feel that'll be useful. But thank you so much for coming this evening. We do hope you found that useful.